Why aren't the politicians talking about
Let's
this?
bring in Dr. James Boyes. He's from King's College London, and he's an expert on US politics. James, are you there? I trust that you've been listening to our conversation
good to speak to you, Bill.
so far. Great, good to see you there live in London. So what's your perspective on all of this, particularly the US and EU relations at the moment? And was there a lot of pressure brought upon the EU countries by the US over this? What's your view?
Yeah, it's fascinating, actually, and one of the problems of going last, of course, is that sometimes all one can do is agree with what's been said previously, but it is somewhat hypocritical for the European leaders and the EU as a central organisation to be bemoaning the United States and talking about holding up transatlantic negotiations at the very time that they're clearly being complicit in ensuring that the Bolivian president's aircraft hasn't had safe passage through European airspace. So there is clearly a hypocrisy at stake here, which I think a number of your guests have already picked up upon, and we need to discuss that in more detail, I think.
But what about the eventual political fallout all over this? Because it's all over one man, isn't it, at the moment? And then, of course, secondary to this, in a way, is the fact of the surveillance allegations. But in the long term, this is all going to blow over because the EU can't afford to fall out with the US, bearing in mind its economic crisis at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a lot of focus upon the one individual at the heart of this, Ed Snowden. But what you're seeing, I think, as nation after nation denies him the right to a safe abode, is national interest coming to the fore. Whatever one thinks about his political attempts to expose espionage by the United States, these countries that he's applying to and being rejected from in terms of safe passage are recognizing that whilst they may sympathize with him, there's a degree of naivety to his perspective and position, and that none of these nations can afford to fall out with the United States, least of all Europe, who of course are very interested in pursuing a transatlantic free trade zone, for example. And that's something, of course, which is being held over the head of British Prime Minister David Cameron, who desperately wants a European trade negotiation. But it comes at the exact moment, of course, whereby here in London there's all talk about getting out of the EU. So there's no doubt that transatlantic trade is a very hot topic at this moment, and is being continued into the area of Ed Snowden. And how national leaders must wish this individual would just disappear and allow transatlantic trade to get on unimpeded.
Exactly, Anissa, I was just going to say,
Well, I wanted to talk about the fact that I think, at least for the Latin Americans, and we'll talk more about this, I think, in more depth a little bit later, I don't think they care about free trade or the European economy. International law has been violated, and are we going to continue this trend, people will be asking, of it just being okay? It's just going to be swept under the carpet, like every other violation that has happened.
What do you think, James?
I think we need to consider which South American countries we're talking about here and how much they value their trade relationship with the United States. Let's see whether any members of NAFTA, for example, or any continuing states there come out. I think it's important to recognise that national interest will trump individual issues with regards to personal integrity over the all. I think ultimately there's an awful lot of hypocrisy at stake here, and that's being recognised. When you have Vladimir Putin, for example, calling upon Snowden to stop releasing material for fear of damaging US relations and US partners, I think that speaks to the heart of the issue. When the leader of Russia is clearly not happy offering amnesty and free passage to this individual. When the Chinese authorities, for example, clearly don't want him to stay in Hong Kong, and when Ecuador is refusing to give him safe passage, I think it speaks to the contradictions and the problems at the heart of all this, and raises a spectre of who is really pulling Ed Snowden's strings here.
All right, and just briefly, will Snowden end up in the US's hands? Because it all seems to be playing into their hands at the moment, because nobody wants Snowden in their country by the looks of things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one wonders where he could end up. I mean, his list of options is growing very, very short. I understand that Tehran is nice this time of year, maybe North Korea, but short of those two rather unattractive options, I think really he's running out of road. He's clearly a man without a country. His passport's been revoked. He can't stay in the Russian airport indefinitely. I'm sure they're going to run out of duty-free pretty soon. So at some point, he's going to have to leave and go somewhere. And wherever he ends up, it will be almost certainly somewhere that the United States has a full extradition treaty with, which will see him returned at some point, I'm sure,
but people said, sorry,
Sam.
Dr. Boyes, people said the same exact thing about Julian Assange, and he's still holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy.
Yes, not too far away from you.
He is, and it's quite clear that the Ecuadorian government is quite embarrassed by that, and he can't stay there indefinitely. And at some point, he will have to face the music, you know, whether it's today, tomorrow, or at some point in the near future. I'm sure you'll agree he cannot stay in the Ecuadorian embassy indefinitely.
All right, James, we'll leave it there for the moment with you in London. Thank you very much indeed. Dr. James Boys there, expert on US politics from King's College London. Really interesting to get your thoughts.